Alright, so for this video, Year 12 PDHPE Option 4 Improving Performance, we're looking at the dot point, elements to be considered when designing a training session. So on the left-hand side of the syllabus, in this video, we're going to cover 6 things, which are health and safety considerations, providing an overview of the session to athletes, warm-up and cool-down, skill instruction and practice, conditioning, and evaluation. On the right-hand side of the syllabus, we're going to examine different methods of structured training sessions and design and implement a training session for a specific event. Evaluate the session by considering questions such as, did the activities match the abilities of the group? What was the reaction of the group? And how could the session be modified? Let's go. All right, so our first one is looking at health and safety considerations, all right? So the 6 things I'm going to go through in this video, they're basically an outline from start to finish, all the things you need to consider and take into account when you design a training session. So the first one being health and safety considerations. The training session and the coach should work together to promote the well-being of athletes and ensure that they can participate safely, all right? That's number 1, all right? The outcomes are not number 1. Safety and health and well-being is number 1. Coaching method should minimize the risk of injury, okay? In other words, you're not going to push the athletes harder than they can currently go because that may cause a risk of injury, or you're not going to force them to do something which is dangerous or force them to do something which can be modified to make it safer with the same outcomes. E.g., forcing them to run in the rain. That's silly. You just move them indoors. You can run them indoors. Same outcome, less injury. And plans should be adapted to account for short-term illnesses, headaches, flu, etc., or weather changes. You may be a beautiful sunny day in the morning, but then to come afternoon time it may be raining and you had a session planned outside. What do you do? Hopefully you've got a plan there. So the specific, and then finally we need to consider athletes' specific medical requirements, all right? Asthma, diabetes, etc. So common considerations that you would take into account as a coach. Medical requirements, specifically like asthma, making sure the athletes have puffers, and if not, they have puffers available. If they're diabetics, making sure their blood sugars are okay, ready for participation. Consider the grounds and facilities that you're using. A common example would be like potholes in the ground. Consider the equipment the athletes are using. Example, shin guards, mouth guards, etc. So safety equipment, but also the other types of equipment such as balls, bats, etc. Looking at the weather. So whether it's raining, whether it's humid, etc., and then moving sessions to areas that are not affected by such as air-conditioned indoor areas. Or finally, looking at short-term illness, such as flu, headache. So athletes that have these symptoms may not push it, the intensity as hard or make the session as long so that they can still get some training effect, but also not to hamper their recovery and also their health and well-being as number 1. So that's our health and safety considerations. All right, so the next thing we're doing is we're going to provide an overview of the session, okay? So sessions are designed with clear, specific goals that are communicated to the athletes, okay? So for example, at the very start of the session, you sit down with the athlete or athletes and you say, all right, today guys, we're focusing on strategy and tactics. Or today, guys, we're focusing on conditioning, aerobic fitness, strength, whatever it is that the goal of the session is, all right? If you put too many different goals in one session, it's not going to be productive. You're not going to actually spend enough time and quality time on set activities to develop anything. Whereas a training session should have a goal, all right? And that's communicated to the athlete at the start. This allows the athlete to mentally prepare for the session. All right, okay, so I know that we're going to do lots of strategy and tactics today, get my head in the game, this is what I'm going to do. And it also allows athletes to ask questions about the session. So how are we going to do that? Are we going to do that in game sense? Or they can raise any concerns that they have about what the session has planned prior to the activity. So if you go back to the health and safety considerations and tying it into the overview, if today you said, today we're focusing on aerobic conditioning, and then some athlete at this point then said, well, actually, coach, I've got a rolled ankle. I didn't tell you prior because there was no time, but I'm not going to be able to do lots of extended running. So if you didn't provide an overview of the session, that athlete could then get severely injured based off their pre-existing injury, all right? So this is a very important step. It also fosters good coach-athlete rapport, which leads to greater training productivity, and if you get more out of your training, you then get greater outcomes. So that's providing an overview of the session. All right, so our third element is now going to be our warm-up and then our cool-down, but the cool-down will be like right at the end. Hopefully you get that. If not, we're in trouble. All right, so a warm-up, first of all, reduces the risk of injury, okay, through increased core temperature and blood flow to working muscles, okay? This is like the 8th time in the last, 12 months we've covered warm-ups. Hopefully you're good with your warm-ups now. A general warm-up is going to consist of 5 to 10 minutes of cardio to get that sweat on the brow effect. Then we're going to move into some stretches, mainly focused on dynamic stretches, okay, because that is part of our warm-up. You can do some static, but if you're going to do static, you need to follow it with dynamic. And then we're going to move into sport-specific movements, okay? For example, walking lunges, high knees, agility ladders, etc. for soccer players, okay? You wouldn't necessarily do that for swimmers. It also gives the coach an opportunity to observe their athletes for injuries, which they may not have identified in the previous session because they think they're tough. Identify lethargy, okay, so athletes may be dragging their feet in the warm-up, well that's probably a good indication they're not going to train as well that day. Or the other one I've got here is post-rehab. So if you've got an athlete who's returning to play after going through the rehabilitation procedures, and they think they're ready for play, but they get into the warm-up and they struggle to complete this, then they probably can't complete the training session to desired effect either. Then you look at your cool down. So you cool down right at the end of the session. Okay, it does start the recovery process. A good cool down will start the recovery process. And remember, adequate recovery is extremely important. So therefore, they're able to hit the next training session ready to go. If athletes are still recovering by the time they get to their next training session, then either A, they trained way too hard, or B, their recovery was not good enough and they need to improve their recovery. A cool down will assist by removing byproducts from the working muscles from the warm-up, and it will also start to deliver oxygen-rich blood and nutrient-rich blood to replenish nutrients that were lost in the training session. And our guidelines for our cool down is that we're going to do some light cardio, okay, so nothing intense, just pretty much movement just to facilitate blood flow. Some static stretching has a good place in a cool down, and some foam rolling also has a good place in our cool down too. So that's warm up, cool down. All right, so our fourth part is looking at skill instruction and practice, all right? So we've considered the health and safety of our athletes, we've provided an overview of the session, we've done our warm-up, and now we're getting into the next thing, or the first part of the real training session, which would be skill instruction and practice, all right? So the coach briefly explains the drills and activities that the athletes are going to do that day, all right, and the purpose of them. The explanation of those drills and activities needs to be brief and simple for two reasons. So one, the athletes easily understand what's going on, okay? Because if you just sit there talking for 10, 15 minutes about the drill they're going to do or the activity they're going to do, a lot of it's just going to go over their head and they're not going to know what's going on. So keep it simple, keep it brief. But also the second reason, so that the effect of the warm-up, WU, warm-up, is not lost, all right? If you sit your athletes down for 10, 15 minutes, especially when the weather is like a little bit cold or windy, then the risk of injury goes way back up again when they start the drill and activity. So keep it brief, to the point. New skills and tactics, so stuff the athletes have not done before, should occur first after the warm-up while the athletes are still fresh. And I mean like mentally fresh, okay? Not physically, but mentally fresh. So if you are having like an hour-long training session and you do like 6 or 7 drills that you've done previously, and then towards the 50-minute mark you introduce the new thing, it's going to be too much. It's going to go over their head. They're not going to retain that information. So the new stuff needs to be done first, and then you can rely or go back to the old stuff, which they already know, later on, when they don't need to think about it as much. Skills and tactics and drills should be supported with visuals, okay? So the best visual you can do is a demonstration, get a couple of athletes, show them what's happening so everyone understands the drill, or the tactic, or the strategic play, whatever it is, or alternatively drawings. And in an ideal world, you're going to do both. You're going to draw it on like a little board that you might have. A lot of coaches carry around like a little whiteboard and they draw stuff on. Then you're going to demo it to the athletes, then you're going to get them up and do the thing. And then finally, if we're talking about strategic play and tactics and skills, they should be practiced not only in like a drill setting, like running between cones or whatever, but they should also be practiced in game-like situations, okay? So that they can then transfer that skill that they learned into a game-like situation and therefore into their competitive play on the weekend or whenever they play it. So that's skill instruction and practice. All right, so our fifth one we're looking at is conditioning, all right? So general fitness conditioning, okay, should occur separate to our skills, drills, and tactics. All right. I just told you that doing new skills, drills, and tactics, etc., should be done right at the start of that part of the session, straight after the warm up when they're fresh. Okay. This is the opposite. So if we're now going to work on our fitness components, generally you don't need much thought in that. It's just hard work. So we put it separately. So for example, you may do it in the second half of a training session, or if you're planning an hour-long training session, your warm-up may go for 10 minutes. Your skills, drills, tactics may run for 25 minutes, and then you may do 20 minutes of conditioning at the end of that, or a completely separate session, all right? And I have spoken about in past where some team athletes will do 2 a days, and like the morning session, they'll focus on conditioning, and then the afternoon session, they'll focus on tactics. The conditioning that is done by the athletes should be goal specific to them, all right, and their positions. So for example, we're looking at a soccer player, a midfielder should be performing much more aerobic work than a goalkeeper. So they may both do like a 20-minute aerobic session in that training block, but then the midfielder may do some extra work on top of that just because they need to, all right? A midfielder, I'm not saying goalkeepers don't need to be fit, mind you. They need to be more than adequately fit for their position, but a midfielder will generally do a lot more running than a goalkeeper. Most team sports will always include some cardiorespiratory endurance work, all right, so 20 plus minutes of aerobic work, etc., to improve their physical and mental fatigue resistance in future sessions, all right? So while all of the components of fitness are going to be important, and the skill-related components of fitness are going to be important based on what position or what sport you're playing in, cardiorespiratory endurance is always going to be king. It's going to be number one. Not only will it reduce your ability to fatigue, all right, improve your stamina, but also mentally, all right? If you can stick it out for 20 minutes doing the same thing, monotonous thing over and over again, you're going to build up some mental fortitude, and therefore when it comes to crunch time in a game, you're not going to break down and just throw in the towel. It is vital to ensure that athlete fitness is more than adequate for competitive play to enhance outcomes and reduce risk of injury. And when I say more than adequate, I don't mean like extensively more, but I mean like if you're a soccer player and you know that you're going to be on the pitch for 90 minutes, potentially, and let's say you're running consistently for 65 of those 90 minutes, depending on your position, then you should be able to run for 90 minutes in total, even though you won't have to do that in competition. On the off chance that you did have to do that in competition, the fitness is there, all right? Same as like a basketball player, right? If you can't put in like a good 15, 20 minute block of continuous high intensity work with breaks in between and then do that 4 times, then you're probably not going to be fit enough to meet the needs of competition for conditioning either. So that's conditioning. We've got one more to go. And finally, we've got the evaluation component, all right? So this is right at the end of the training session. It can occur as a separate part of the training session, or you can actually do it during the cool down, all right? It is a part where players will provide feedback on the session to the coach, e.g. what worked well, what could be improved. It allows the coach to therefore gauge whether the intended goal, which was outlined right at the start, providing an overview of the session, was met or not. So for example, if the coach said that today we're going to focus on aerobic conditioning, you run the session, at the end of the session you ask the players, do you feel like you maintain 20 plus minutes of aerobic exercise today at a high intensity or a high enough intensity to develop aerobic conditioning? And most players should say yes, we did, because that training session was very good. Or some of the players may say, well, no, like, yes, you had lots of activities, but there was too much break in between. I don't feel like my aerobic capacity was developed, or whatever. It also allows the coach to check that the intensity was satisfactory for that. So, e.g., the coach thought in their initial planning that the session would be quite hard, quite intense. And then at the end of the session, the coach asked the players, rate the session out of 1 to 10 as to how hard it was or how taxing on your body it was. And the players give it an 8 out of 10. So the coach thought it was going to be hard. The players said 8 out of 10. That's pretty much on point. All right. If the coach thought the session would be hard and then the players rate it as like a 10, then it was probably too hard. Or if the players rated it as a 4, it means that, well, the players are probably fitter than what the coach thought, and therefore the coach can step up the next session. So all of this information, all the feedback provided, is then used to plan the next training session to make it effective. So for example, if in the evaluation part, the players identify that they need more practice and more game-like practice on a new tactic that they learnt today or something or whatever it is, then the coach should take that feedback into consideration for planning the next training session to then spend some more time on that tactic and tactical play within game-like situations. Right, so that's evaluation, and overall that is the end of our video on the elements to be considered when designing a training session. Thanks, bye.